Good afternoon and welcome. My name's Steve Luby. I serve as the director of Stanford Center for Human and Planetary Health. We recognize that Stanford sits on the ancestral land of the Muwekwa Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. Consistent with our values of community and inclusion, we have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible the university's relationship to Native people. This afternoon, we have the opportunity to hear from Katharine Hayhoe, one of the most prominent scientific communicators on the causes and consequences of climate change. At Stanford Center for Human and Planetary Health, we recognize that thriving human communities rely on a healthy planet. But worldwide, human actions are destroying the global environment. Our center, which is a partnership between the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment and the Center for Innovation and Global Health in the School of Medicine, is dedicated to urgent, transformative research, strategic training of our youth, and uniting diverse minds to address the critical challenges that we face today. We know that Katharine and the Nature Conservancy share this sense of urgency, and they also share our belief that we can find and implement practical solutions for people and the planet. Katharine Hayhoe is an atmospheric scientist whose research focuses on understanding the impacts of climate change on people and the planet. She's the chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy and a distinguished professor and endowed chair at Texas Tech University. She's received numerous awards, honorary degrees and recognitions for her work, but I'm only allowed to mention two: the Time 100 Most Influential People and a United Nations Champion of the Earth. This afternoon, Katharine will be interviewed by our own Chris Field, the director of Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. Chris is a professor of Earth System Science and a senior fellow both at the Woods Institute and the Precourt Institute for Energy. Chris's research focuses on climate change, especially solutions that can improve lives now, decrease the amount of future warming, and support vibrant economies. We're grateful to have two prominent climate scientists in the room today and to be able to participate in a conversation with them about the intersection of health and the environment. They'll engage in a conversation for the next 35 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to the audience to ask questions. Following this conversation, we'll then have a 30-minute reception. Thank you all for being here. Chris, over to you.
Well, welcome, Katharine. Before we start, I just want to acknowledge Steve and Center for Human and Planetary Health and the great work they're doing, and also thank Michelle for the partnership with the Center for Innovation and Global Health. The last time, or the first time that you and I worked together was more than 20 years ago.
It was.
And one of the things I've been thinking about lately is that we're in a time when work on climate change is frustrating, challenging, and it's scary. But 20 years ago, when we worked together on this assessment of climate change impacts on California, we were in an era where climate change was being removed from federal websites, where data sets were being deleted, and where prominent climate scientists in the federal government were being dismissed. And I wonder if you can speak to the similarities and the differences and what you've learned from the experiences of former anti-climate administrations that have helped shape the way you think about the current moment.
Yes. So Chris and I originally met when we were working together on the first assessment in the US, and I think one of the very first in the world, to compare what we expect to happen under a higher versus a lower future scenario. So I know this is going to sound surprising today, but 20, 25 years ago, most people were doing future projections based on the mid-range scenarios. And what that does is it completely removes humans from the equation. It says, here's what's going to happen no matter what, just adapt. And so the project we did together actually documented for California what's going to happen if we take action on climate change versus what's going to happen if we don't. And the power of bringing humans into the equation was so incredible that a year and a half after our paper was published, and that paper was where Chris taught me how to write a good paper. I wrote the draft, and then he took it, he's like, this is not a PNAS paper. And he actually showed me how to write a good PNAS paper, for which I'm forever grateful, and I have passed that skill on since then.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sure I don't deserve that compliment.
Oh, no, he does. A year and a half after that study, the governor of California, who at that time was Schwarzenegger, signed the executive order making California the first state in the country to have mandatory greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. And he signed that order with a semicircle of our California authors behind him, including the late Steve Schneider, who was based here at Stanford. And that was a policy that was made because of science, which was really incredible. So that was a high. And I feel like what's been happening, Chris, to your question is, we've been seeing this cycle of climate action highs and climate action lows, because that was immediately followed by the Bush administration, where Jim Hansen was being silenced and climate data was being removed. And I was serving on it as a lead author on the second National Climate Assessment at that time, and we were getting the type of edits from the government that was literally like change will to will not. So that was the low that immediately followed. And what I feel like, and I'd be curious to see if you feel like this too, is that the amplitude of the highs and lows is increasing. So we are getting closer and closer to really effective action. Like the Inflation Reduction Act was the biggest piece of climate legislation the US has ever seen. And in other countries around the world, wherever I went, people were saying, oh my gosh, that was huge. How are we even going to compete? And then that was immediately followed by the lowest low we've seen. The amount of science that's being shuttered and canceled, the amount of data that's being taken offline, the amount of changes that are happening far exceed anything that we've had in previous lows. And so as this amplitude increases, the chances of actually making something stick, I think, are increasing too. Because the closer we get to something that actually works, we're going to actually get something that works and sticks. But the question is by when?
But on the other hand, the highs and lows mean that investors and corporations aren't getting the kind of consistent signals that they would like to have in order to make investments. And one of the things I would like to hear your thoughts on is whether, even in this chaotic government environment, we're seeing some kinds of signals in states and communities and in corporations that provides a little bit of modulation.
We definitely are. So I think our California study was a good example of how climate action, effective climate action, really happens at different scales. And if you think of climate action as a giant boulder with many, many hands pushing that boulder down the hill, what federal legislation does is it alters the slope that you're pushing that boulder along. So the Inflation Reduction Act basically made the slope a lot steeper. It was easier to push the boulder down the hill.
Or
now
it rolled on its own.
Yes, some of it would roll on its own. Then, obviously, now they're doing their best to bring it up to level and actually make it an uphill push. But someone argued recently, I thought this was a really interesting take, that the last time the US pulled out of the Paris Agreement, you're familiar with the We Are Still In movement, and America is still in, which they're calling it today. That was the states, the cities, the organizations, tribal nations, universities, and companies that all stood up publicly and said, we are still in and we're going to meet the Paris targets. Well, that's what we need. Because if everybody thinks the federal government is going to do it for them, nobody is going to take the action they need to proactively. They're just going to wait to respond to whatever the federal government's doing. So knowing that the federal government doesn't have it actually, I think, encourages others to step up and say, okay, we actually have to do our part too. Now, is it good if the federal government stays out entirely the whole time or opposes it? No. But we need action at every level, and we can't afford to say, oh, they're going to take care of it for us, because there is no they. It's all of us.
One of the things I've always admired about your approach is the amount that you invest in talking to conservatives and people who are inherently skeptical about science and government regulations. And I wonder, as you speak to political conservatives today, how people are falling out in terms of understanding that the climate's changing, but understanding that we're in a political environment that's very antagonistic toward that.
So I think your question is best answered by a conversation I recently had with a cotton farmer in West Texas. That's sort of my barometer of where things are at, is the cotton farmers in West Texas. And he said, whatever you want to call it, something ain't right. So we've gotten to the point now where last fall, not even this past fall, but the fall before, 9 out of 10 Americans said they'd been personally affected by extreme weather. And 2/3 of those connected it to a changing climate. The majority of people in the US agree climate is changing, and in fact, the majority, 2/3 in the US, are worried about it. But they don't understand why it matters to them personally until their home is washed away, and nobody knows what to do about it. So across the US, the biggest demographic is people who are worried but not activated. That demographic is over 55% of the country, is worried but not activated. And so what people most need to know, I think, is what solutions look like that are practical, are positive, are doable, are not about penalizing people, but actually about making their life better. And I think that's what really could move the needle.
And do you feel like that fraction and that level of activation has changed substantially in the last 4 months, or?
Well, I know what's changing is the number of people who are worried is actually increasing. And it's increasing because they're starting to see the impacts in their life. But the number who are activated is not changing because people still don't know what to do. And for example, with the Inflation Reduction Act, what I feel was the biggest failure associated with that, and I'm not telling you anything I haven't already told other people before, they didn't talk about it. Mm-hmm. Nobody knew what it was or what it was doing. You know, the majority of the investments were in red states. Do you think anybody in red states knew that? No. No. If Trump had created the Inflation Reduction Act.
Okay.
Yes. If every factory that was built would have had a giant billboard with courtesy of Donald J. Trump on that billboard. Every new, solar farm or battery manufacturing that opened would have had a giant ribbon with him cutting it, taking pictures of it. Everything that people saw would have had his brand stamped all over it to say, I brought you this. But with the Inflation Reduction Act, nobody knew what they were getting, who did it, and why. And so that's why I talk so much about communication, because I've started to realize we can have the best science, we can have the best solutions, but if people don't understand why it matters and how it helps them, we're not going to get long-term change.
And just to be fair, there are a number of red state congressmen and senators who are very supportive of the investments that the IRA has made in their states. But it is really true that they're kind of the only ones who are paying attention, and we're not seeing the consequences of the really big investments that have been made. What would you do? Would you go down and unveil a big banner across each of those new battery factories?
I definitely would. And I would have a lot of information on that meets people where they're at in terms of, hey, you live here. Did you know there's 1,100 new jobs here? And maybe you know somebody who has one of these jobs, and here's why those jobs exist. Did you know that your power bill just went down, and here's why it went down? I would actually make that head-to-heart connection again and again, because now we're at the point where our communication is so targeted that there are literally people who at very low cost can say, okay, there's somebody standing with their phone at 2 p.m. at the corner of State and Main who bought a bicycle in the last 100 days, who typically eats Japanese food for lunch, and they can actually say, okay, they should see this video on TikTok. So where are the efforts to actually share this type of information, similar to after the LA wildfires? Everybody was inundated with false information about why they happened and who was responsible and what the solutions were. So we're way behind in the communication game because, as George Lakoff says, who's a cognitive linguist who studies how and why people communicate, people of more liberal persuasions tend to feel that the truth is self-evident. You don't need to talk about it because it's obvious. But in this case, it isn't. We have to talk about it, and we just aren't.
And say a few things about what your philosophy of how to talk about it more is. And you've been a spectacular example throughout your career of talking to everybody whenever they would listen. But why is it that the rest of the community that wants to see progress on this issue hasn't been activated? And how would you recommend that the rest of the community begins to step up?
That's a great question. I think there's just, again, there's sort of a cultural resistance to the idea that if it's true, that we have to tell people it's true. We sort of feel like if something is true, if this is good, if this is true, then everybody just knows that. But unfortunately, in today's ecosphere, we don't. We need to be told what's happening and why it matters. And so communication is not just about the facts. The facts are important. We're scientists. We want to make sure everything's based on the actual facts. But I think of that as the head. So all of the data and information has led most people to be worried, but they haven't made the head-to-heart connection. The technical term for that is psychological distance, and you can see it in the data. You say, are you worried? And most people say yes. And then you say, do you think climate change will affect you personally? The numbers get cut in half. That's psychological distance. And then you say, are you activated? And the numbers are cut by a factor of 4. That's the hands. People haven't connected to the heart to the hands. So when we have these conversations, we need to tell people what's happening, but they need to know why it matters, and they need to know what we are already and can be doing about it. We need that 3-part package to really catalyze action.
Let me push back just a little bit on this concept that the head-to-heart connection is the key one. And in defending my progressive community, I think many people would argue that, well, we win on the facts, and if this becomes an issue of argumentation and emotion, then we lose connection with the key resource we have, and everybody can activate whatever emotions they want, and that it becomes an unfair battle. It's fair if it's fact against fact. But what you're saying is that fair doesn't win, I guess.
And I wish you were right. I mean, as scientists, I want it to just be who has the best facts wins. But you know, our community's been trying that since before either of us were scientists. The first time scientists formally warned a US president of the risks of climate change was 1965. The first IPCC report came out in 1990. And climate change became polarized after it came out, not before. Because that's when people realized, hey, we got to swing into action if we want to prevent climate action. And when you actually think about it, as humans, and this is a very humbling realization, we, even as scientists, we make a lot of decisions with our heart. We want it to be rational and supported by the data, but we often make it based on the heart. So there's a lot of psychological mechanisms we use to make decisions, and one of them is motivated reasoning, where we make up our mind based on who we are, our culture, our identity, and then we use our brain to go out and find reasons that explain why we're right. And ironically, the smarter we are, the better we are at it. So when I learned about motivated reasoning, I thought, well, of course, I don't do that. That's just something people do who aren't aware of it. And then I started to think. So I'm Canadian, I grew up in Canada, and waste not, want not was part of what I was taught when it comes to food. You eat the leftovers. My husband grew up in the South, and so he grew up with much more of the idea that, if food gets left out, it could be dangerous. Because, the days before refrigeration, you could get really sick. So we had, for a number of years, a conflict over whether you leave stuff out on the counter or not, and whether you eat something that is close to or just past its expiration date or not. And in our arguments, I would go find peer-reviewed journal articles that explains why yogurt that's a week past its deadline can certainly be eaten in complete safety. And then he would go out and find peer-reviewed journal articles explaining why if I left out the hamburger on the counter for more than 4 hours, it would kill you. And I realized that was what we're doing. We were engaging in motivated reasoning because it was our cultural values that were causing us to make these decisions. In some cases, cultural values that went back multiple generations. Because, of course, you've had refrigeration in the South for many years already. Many decades, I should say. So we like to think that we're all that purely rational being, that sort of brain in the jar, so to speak. But even we, in certain circumstances, as scientists, can make decisions from our heart, and that is really what drives a lot of the decisions that people make.
I guess where I was coming from was slightly different, and it's the idea that if it's an argument about emotions, it's the entity that can hire the best PR firm that tends to win because they have the resources, they've got the the focus groups, they figure out how to make people believe in the wrong stuff. And is it just that we need to do better than them? And how do we do it?
Well, I hate to say it, but I think that's exactly what's happened.
Oh, I agree.
Yeah. And in fact, if you look at the data, most of the online news influencers are right-wing versus left-wing. And they are the ones telling people climate isn't changing, or humans aren't responsible, their impacts aren't serious, or it's too late anyways. I think that we need to enter the field rather than say we're not going to play. But I do believe that truth makes a difference. So I guess the answer is yes.
So say a few things about that. I think that the most interesting thing that we could do now is speak directly to people's emotions, to activate their energies, to make the hands engaged, but at the same time, make them care about or utilize the fact that truth is on our side.
Yes.
And I think if there's something that's under attack in the Trump administration, it's probably that there is such a thing as truth and that it makes a difference.
I agree, and that's why I think what we can do, I think we have the chance to actually win at their own game, because when I'm talking about engaging people's hearts, and I'm sure you're talking about this too, it's not by making up false reasons. It's by literally showing them that air pollution cuts your fertility rates. And the fact that your child is going to the hospital so many times for asthma might be because you have a gas stove in your house. And the fact that you can't get insurance for your home anymore, and that means that you're not going to be able to pay your mortgage because your mortgage requires insurance, is because climate field risks are increasing where you live. So there's a host of factual head-to-heart connections, I think, that remain to be made, not manufactured, and that's the difference.
And say a little bit more about how you think about making those connections.
It's really interesting because something you said sort of reminded me of that. It's not about making people care. It's about showing them that they already care and they didn't know it. And that's a key difference. So let me say it in very clear terms, which sound ridiculous. One reason people care about climate change is because it affects birds, and they're a birder. So a number of years ago, the Audubon Society released a report showing that the Baltimore Oriole wouldn't be native to Baltimore anymore, and things that birders would care passionately about. So does that mean that everybody has to become a birder to care about climate change? No, right? But all too often, we try to make people care for the same reason that we do. But instead, what I would argue for is, if they're a human being living on planet Earth, and they don't intend to go to Mars as soon as they can and spend the rest of their life there, if they do, I wish they would actually go. Sooner the better. But aside from that small number of people, if we live on planet Earth, if we breathe the air, drink the water, eat the food, if everything and everybody we love is here, then we already have a reason. And our job is to help them find out what that reason is. So that requires listening and asking questions and having conversations, not just jumping in and telling people stuff. So after I wrote my book, Saving Us, my editor had a friend at CBS Morning News, and she said, okay, I'm going to pull this string for you. They're going to do an interview with you about the book. And I was like, oh, well, that's phenomenal. And so I got a call from them. They said, well, we're actually going to come to Dallas, and we're going to take you out somewhere, and you're just going to cold start conversations with people. And you're going to find out why they already care about climate change, and we're going to film it. And I was like, oh, gosh. Because it doesn't always work, right? It works a lot, but it doesn't always. So we went to the Dallas Aquarium, and there's the big camera crew with me, and I'm like, okay, and they're like, well, we're going to pick the people. I'm like, oh my gosh. So they look around, and they see this guy with a little daughter, this youngish father, and he had this cap on that had an oil rig on the cap. And they're like, him? So I was like, okay. So I went over and I started the conversation with him, and I asked him at first, hey, do you think, where do you live? He lives in Oklahoma. What do you think about climate change? He's like, oh, I don't think about that at all. I don't think it matters. So then started asking me, why are you here? And it soon became obvious that his little daughter was the light of his life. He started telling me all about her, about everything she loved doing, about why they drove to Dallas to be at the aquarium. And then before he knew it, he started telling me, I wasn't even asking any questions, about how he was really worried about her being outside when it was too hot. Oh boy. Yeah. And how he'd noticed, like since she was born, there was more and more days when they were just really worried about her spending time outdoors. And so he had handed me on a plate the very reasons why he cared about climate change. So it actually worked.
And how did you get a chance to talk to a bunch of people? And I mean, is that so?
It turned out most people already. Somebody else turned out they cared about fashion, and they cared about waste. So we had a good conversation about circular economy and things like that. But yeah.
So say a little bit more then about if I can build on your last comment, the idea is that there's untapped interest and commitment, and that the people who say they're concerned but not activated are close to being activated, that there's the kernel of activation within them, and that they're looking for it to be released.
I love that. That's a great way to put it.
I mean, I was repeating what I heard you say.
No, you were making it better. I like that. I think you're right, because when the folks at Yale who did the analysis showing that only 8% are activated, but almost 2/3 are worried, when they asked the people who are worried but not activated, why not? They said, number one, they didn't know what to do. And they said, number two, no one ever asked them. And so then they said, well, so if somebody asked you to even join a climate protest, which is a pretty big thing to do, right? I think 35% of the worried but not activated people agreed they would join a climate protest if they were invited. I mean, that's a pretty big step, on the scale of activation. There's a lot of things you could do that are a lot easier, a lot less socially committed than that. And so that was very encouraging.
So maybe we could talk for just a couple of minutes about the forces that are still out there that are trying to prevent this transition. And there are obviously companies who are still in that game, and governments around the world, especially governments that are in fossil exporting or fossil dependent nations. And to what extent do you see this as a grand battle between fossil fuel entities and the people who are trying to establish the foundations for a sustainable climate in the future?
Well, that's where the battle began. So I alluded earlier to the fact that scientists first warned a US president back in 1965, but we've known, and when I say we, obviously not Chris or I, we weren't even born. We've known that, no, you were not born in 1880 or 1850.
That's true.
If you were, I want to know your secret.
Yeah.
So science has known that digging up coal and gas and oil and burning it produces heat-trapping gases that are building up in the atmosphere, wrapping an extra blanket around the planet for over 175 years. By 1937, Guy Callendar actually measured the warming of the planet and published a paper, which is very entertaining to read. He essentially says, you're not going to believe what I have to say, but I will show you that the temperature of the planet is increasing in response to the emissions of carbonic acid that he called CO2 because of burning coal, gas, and oil. So when did people start to question the science? Was it when Guy published his results, when Arrhenius published the first climate model by hand in the 1890s? No. They didn't start to actually question the results until this issue moved from a comfortably future issue that we didn't have to actually address to a present issue that we did. And when that happened was the late 80s and early 90s. So the late 80s was when there was a really big heat wave in 1988. Jim Hansen testified to Congress. The IPCC was formed. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed in 92. And people started to see the signal of human influence on the planet. And that meant that this issue moved from a comfortably future issue to a present issue. And so conveniently, there was a lot of people who just lost their jobs at that time. People who used to work for the tobacco industry. And if you've read or watched Merchants of Doubt, you know what I'm talking about? Some of the same people who successfully delayed action on tobacco and lung cancer got employed by the fossil fuel industry to basically sow doubt. They knew they didn't have to convince people it wasn't real. They just had to convince them that maybe we don't know. We have to study it some more. There's plausible alternatives. So all of this actually began pretty recently, 35 years ago. And it was originally definitely, like there's no question, the data is there, it was definitely kicked off by the fossil fuel industry. In fact, there's data on exactly what Exxon did, what even some of the car companies did, what they knew internally and who they decided to fund externally. I myself was attacked with a lot of FOIAs a while ago and accusing me of all kinds of hideous crimes. Because that's the technique. It's pretty scary the first time you get that. And I didn't know who was behind it. It was the Competitive Enterprise Institute that was doing it, but I didn't know who was funding them. And then it turned out, much to my surprise, a coal company went bankrupt. Their records became public knowledge, and they had dictated the FOIAs that were sent to me. But I would welcome your thoughts on this, Chris, because I feel like now, today, there's a lot of people in the fossil fuel industry who realize that we still need energy, but we're transitioning. Like the transition is happening no matter whether you like it or not. So there's a lot of people who, if they had the signal, they would just make the changes. They've seen this coming for a long time, and they're like, okay, we're ready. It's sort of the cigarette equivalent of we have the Surgeon General's warning ready to go in the packets. But now I feel like it's more about retaining the power structures. And that's part of the supportive mechanism, but there's people who are literally cutting off their nose to spite their face. There's no economic sense to some of the decisions and some of the bills that are being proposed. It's literally just retaining the power. What do you think?
Well, one of the things I think is that for the past 15 years or so, we've seen action switch from denial to delay.
Yeah.
And I think from the perspective of especially petroleum exporting countries, but to some extent fossil fuel companies in the US, they benefit from slowing the transition by 5 years or 10 years, and I think that framework has been operational for them. And so it's not a question of denying the science, but it is a question of being the last producer out there. One of the things I'm very concerned about is what happens in a new narrative that says we want to create a fossil-fueled and prosperous future, the kind of the RCP 8.5 world that in 2004 we said was the what if we don't take any action world, and we're seeing specific investments now to create that world, not the world we've been working for.
And when you say a prosperous world, it's becoming increasingly clear that the only people who would be prospering in that world are the people who are sufficiently insulated, which is a tiny fraction of the world's population.
Yeah, and I think we've suffered throughout the climate action era by focusing on aggregate statistics and not the full distribution of effects, where it becomes so clear. And let me ask you about that. It seems like in the current America First agenda, it's more and more challenging to acknowledge the shared responsibility and the very unequal distribution of vulnerability around the world, and the unequal distribution of vulnerability in our country.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because back 30 years ago, socioeconomic inequality was primarily between country. And then that's flipped, and now the largest share of socioeconomic inequality is typically within country. And we know, and some of the work is being done right here at Stanford, that within a given city, the inequality due to, say, the prevalence of green space and its impact on cooling during heat waves, or the inequality in terms of who is or isn't able to even purchase a house because they can get insurance, that inequality is increasing right here, let alone anywhere else.
And when we think about a shared responsibility, it's a lot easier to cast that in the framework of
Yeah.
who's vulnerable in our own country. We're getting close to the point where I want to turn to all of you for questions, but there's one other topic I definitely want to bring up in the context of the Human and Planetary Health Center, which is that I know TNC has recently launched an initiative in Human and Planetary Health. Can you say a little about that?
Yeah. So you're probably familiar with the Nature Conservancy as a conservation organization. I mean, it's in the title, right? But increasingly, in a rapidly changing and unstable world, you can't preserve and conserve. That's not possible when you're faced with the pollution crisis, the biodiversity crisis, the climate crisis, the economic or inequality crisis. You can't do that. You have to craft a better future. And you have to do that with people. So increasingly at the Nature Conservancy, we have 6 very ambitious goals for 2030, and the goals are related to providing food, water, and livelihoods for the most climate vulnerable people, for not just conserving ocean and conserving land and conserving water, but also restoring carbon into ecosystems, which obviously is something a lot of people here at Stanford are working on too, and part of the Natural Capital Project, and even the work you do yourself, Chris. And all of that has to be done in partnership between local communities, between people, and between nature. Increasingly also, we are all collectively realizing that our health depends on the health of the planet. The obvious examples are how millions of people die from pollution from burning fossil fuels alone every year. You know, it was 2000 when I think Luis Cifuentes published that really short paper in Science showing that if you look at the costs of coal, in terms of health impacts and lost worker days, we just shouldn't be burning coal at all. And that was back in the 1990s that he made, the data came from. So the connections are obvious. And at the Nature Conservancy, you know, we work in 50 different states and we work in 80 different countries around the world. And there's always been a lot of work that has started to touch on health, whether it's looking at food or water or the role of nature in supporting health. And last year, researchers in Kentucky just completed the first clinical trial of nature, which is really cool. They did it with the local med school. And what the Nature Conservancy did was working with 2 low-income neighborhoods. The Nature Conservancy worked with the community to help green one of the neighborhoods and not the other. And this was working with the local community. And then the researchers at the medical school measured the inflammation markers in people's blood. And they showed that as the neighborhood got green, the inflammation markers went down, which, as many of you know more than I do, it's associated with everything from heart disease to mental health. So there's so much potential to bring in new partners. Like, a lot of people in the healthcare industry think, oh, well, climate and nature, that has nothing to do with me. But not only is health a major motivator for people to act on climate, there's actually climate and nature solutions that help with health. So just this past year, we were very fortunate. The chair of the global board of the Nature Conservancy is former Senate Majority Leader Bill Frist, who, when he was in office, was Republican. And he is passionate about climate and nature. And so he invested in actually starting a Center for Planetary and Human Health at the Nature Conservancy, which is all about looking at nature as a solution to health. And so we're really excited about kicking that off and about partnering with people right here, your initiative as well, and others, because I think there's so much that we can do to build that better future and to show people how, you know, if you just look at nature around the world and around the US, most people support nature positive solutions, but they haven't tied that to health, they haven't tied that to climate. And so I think when we bring that health aspect into it, that health lens, there's so much potential that we have not yet tapped in terms of catalyzing action and resources for positive change.
And your comments didn't speak directly to the role of climate in human and planetary health, but it seems like that's an important foundation. Is that a fair way to say it?
It is. I mean, if you look at all the ways climate change affect our health, obviously the first one is through the direct impact from extreme heat. And then there's also the fact that the warmer it gets, the worse the air pollution gets. And the air pollution typically comes from what causes climate change in the first place. Then you've got the impacts, the direct impacts from extreme weather events. And then you've got the very long tail of the impacts from extreme weather events. You know, the research that was just done here showing that the death toll from hurricanes has a very, very long tail and is much greater than people ever thought. Then you've got the fact that rising CO2 levels decreases the nutritional content of food. Then you've got the fact that waterborne illnesses and vector-borne diseases are spreading and the ranges are changing. And then you've got the fact that climate change is destabilizing entire regions and systems and countries. And when when climate change exacerbates refugee crises, all of a sudden something like stepping on a rusty nail or having a baby becomes a life-threatening illness. And so in my opinion, that's actually the biggest health impact from climate change. I'm sure I missed one there, mental health. I didn't even mention that. That's one of the leading sources of mental anxiety among many people. In fact, I gave a talk on Sunday, just yesterday at church, and one of the people there said, the reason why I'm here is because my wife has cared about climate change for a long time, and she's told me how important it is. And so I said, oh, well, where's your wife? He said, she's so anxious she couldn't come. She just literally couldn't come and listen to a talk about climate change, which I totally respect. You have to set your boundaries. So yes, so there's that myriad of ways.
Let me ask one last question before we turn it over to the audience. And
we can keep going for a long time, you can see.
I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on whether you think about various environment-friendly agendas competing with each other or working in a symbiotic way, and how do you assure that whatever resources we have available for tackling climate and environment work together rather than splintering a community?
That's a great question. I think that's happened a lot in the past. And it's often happened because sometimes it's just a zero-sum game in terms of funding. You're like, look, there's this limited set of funding. You have to compete against each other to get it, which is very sad. And then sometimes it's because people require a very narrow focus for their work. But the best solutions, I think, are the solutions that bring people together who care about different things, and they all find a reason to care. Like, for example, greening that low-income neighborhood. People could care because of health. They could care because of home value. They could care because they finally had a place to take their kids to play outside that was safe. They could care because it reduced their power bill. And so you could get all kinds of people at the table who cared about different things, everything from energy equity to racial equity, to human health, to nature, obviously, all working together.
And they need successful nudging from someone like you to help them realize that they're all part of the same complex of issues.
Exactly.
Okay,
and that's why I have to say that I really appreciate the work the Nature Conservancy does. So like you probably, like I had heard of the Nature Conservancy. I had probably made some donations from my paycheck, I think, to the Nature Conservancy. You know, when you have that thing at the university when it tells you today's giving day, who do you want to give to? But I hadn't really had a lot of contact with the Nature Conservancy before they approached me and started to convince me that I really needed to join them. And when I did, I feel like the reason why I did and the reason why I'm still there is because the Nature Conservancy is so collaborative. And in many cases, it's not about being out at the front, it's about being behind. And I've learned so many things the Nature Conservancy did that I knew about the things, but I didn't know they were involved. Because they were the ones who brought the people together, who like literally had the room with the table, who extended the invitations. And so, Chris, if you don't mind, would you just share where you just visited?
No.
Because you're on the WWF board, but you just visited a TNC project.
I did indeed. Last week I had a chance to visit a spectacular effort. It's a collaboration between TNC, World Wildlife Fund, WWF, something called the Intertribal Buffalo Council, and the Lakota Nation that purchased a 26,000-acre ranch in western South Dakota and is restoring 1,500 buffalo to it. The partnership is that TNC is actively working to turn this property over to tribal management, and the collaboration between TNC and WWF was TNC bought the land and WWF bought the buffalo.
I love that.
Questions for Katharine? You want to call on people, or you want me to call on people?
Go for it.
In the back.
No, that's you. Yep.
2/3 of the way back.
Yeah. 99.9% of elected officials aren't federal. And there's so much that can be done below the federal level. And so that your initiative is directly tipping a huge lever, I think, that has the potential to make an enormous difference. I do love the magic wand question, but if I had to have an initiative, Chris, I'm going to ask you what you would do too.
I would ask Katharine.
Well, economists would say that the price on carbon is one of the biggest levers. But in terms of whether you could make it work logistically, would be a question for somebody else, not me. I think even something as simple as planning decisions have to consider climate and nature risk. Like, in the UK, there's this amazing new law for development that says that if you are developing undeveloped lands, you have to restore an equal area of nature. So just actually thinking about climate and nature impact and climate and nature risk in every decision that has to be made, I think that would be a tremendous initiative on the ballot.
Why don't we go over to this side? Yeah, 5 rows back, back, in.
You keep your hand up. Yes, there you go.
Hi, thank you so much for your time. I'm Miriam. I'm an undergraduate student in environmental science, and I was wondering, in creating narratives about climate solutions, what your opinion is on narratives about we need to build more, like we need to build out more clean energy, we need more economic growth driven by clean energy, versus narratives that the solution to climate change is actually degrowth, and we need to degrow the economy to address climate change. Do you have a perspective on whether these narratives can coexist and what might be a better strategy for inspiring people towards climate action?
That's a really good question. My thoughts on that might not please everyone. But from a purely communication perspective, the percentage of the population to which degrowth appeals is pretty low. Those of us to whom it appeals, and I like the word degrowth myself, most of us are probably already on board, and the chances of getting a lot of other people on board are pretty slim. Now, let's look at this logically as a scientist. Can we have infinite growth on a finite planet? Physically, no. It's just impossible. We can't. Is there a different way to communicate the need to live sustainably on a round, finite planet without using the word D? I think there is. So sometimes the concept is essential and unavoidable, like what we were just talking about with facts. You just can't have infinite physical growth on a finite planet. It's just not possible. And honestly, a lot of people know that, and that's why they talk about space exploration. Yes. But even then, it has serious issues. But is there a way to talk about it that would engage people, engage their hearts, and engage their hands? I think there is. And I think that's why we need people who are creative, people who can take facts and who can turn them into narratives and stories and compelling messages that make people say, yes, that's the world I want to live in. And one of the people who I feel like has done that best is Christiana Figueres, who is the architect of the Paris Agreement, who, after she completed the greatest act of bringing together the entire world to sign a global treaty, rather than retreating back home to Costa Rica to a hammock on the beach, which I would have done and never left, instead, right after the Paris Agreement, she wrote a book. And the book was called The Future We Choose. And in it, she laid out very clearly what the future will look like if we continue on our current pathway. And she laid it out in terms of when you wake up, this is what you will feel like. This is what the air will look like as you walk down the street or don't walk down the street. This is what it will be like compared to what it would look like if we did act. And it was so compelling. I didn't feel like, oh gosh, I guess I really should pick that nice world. I mean, I really want the bad world, but I should pick. No, I was like, give me that world. I want to wake up in that world. So that's why we need people who are really good at being creative and at creating those visions of a better future. Because our brains, as we've learned from neuroscience, our brains are wired to move forward towards something positive, much more strongly than we're wired to move away from something negative. We're really good at a knee-jerk reaction, but we can't sustain the multi-year fleeing from the apocalypse without something better to move towards.
Let me follow up on
Yeah, please.
Miriam's question with a question about this book that's generating so much conversation, Abundance, by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson, that basically argues that we do need to build a lot of stuff, and that a lot of the reason we don't build the stuff we need is because traditional environmental groups are holding us back. That they,
Show me how that's happening. I'd like to know.
well, and
Yes.
they argue in terms of regulatory issues, in terms of overlapping jurisdictions, in terms of something they call the Petaluma effect, the no-growth ordinance that Petaluma passed in the 1960s. And do you think that there is an issue with being held back by NIMBYism in terms of generating the future that we need?
I think those might be separate questions. There's no question there's NIMBYism, like no question at all. That definitely exists. And what it does is it perpetuates the inequalities of not wanting whatever infrastructure we need in wealthy neighborhoods that have the political clout to say they don't want it. And there's no question, I think, that regulations can be extremely inefficient and counterproductive. I don't think many people would argue with that. But there's also no question that there are massive inefficiencies in our systems. Massive. I mean, the amount of energy that we waste, over 60% of it is wasted as heat today. When you look at the amount of fossil fuels that are simply used to transport fossil fuels, it's huge. When you look at the food that's wasted, enough food is wasted every year to give every person who suffers from food poverty a really good meal every day. So the inefficiencies in our system, rather than creating more and more and more, if we could deal with the inefficiencies, we would realize, I like the word abundance, we would realize that we have abundance. We actually have it. We just aren't using it.
We need to be smart about it.
Yeah.
Let's go over to this side.
Unfortunately, we live in an information bubble, all of us do today, because I still remember about 12 years ago, I went to a really interesting seminar in my home department. I am now in a political science department. And it was by a researcher from here at Stanford. And he was showing the Pew Political Polarization Survey, where you have like the Republicans and the Democrats, and back in 1990, they sort of looked like this, two very normal distributions that almost entirely overlapped. And then over time, those distributions became much more skewed, and they moved farther and farther and farther apart from each other. And that was the first time I'd actually seen graphical evidence of political polarization. And so my first question was, why is this happening? And so I asked him, and I still remember the answer. He said, well, I don't know for sure, but one of the biggest reasons is access to customized news. So, 30 years ago, everybody would turn on the TV and you'd listen to Walter Cronkite, and you'd read the local newspaper. And nowadays, on your phone, you have access to someone who's saying exactly what you want to hear, and even worse, it's all for profit. And so because it's for profit, the algorithms are tweaked to actually give you something that is a little bit more, and then a little bit more. And in fact, one of my colleagues, Ashley Landrum, she and her grad student, they showed that rise of flat earthism was basically due entirely to one dude in his mother's basement and the YouTube algorithm. And that started like this worldwide revival of flat earthism. So we're all in a bubble. All of us are in a bubble. And it's really hard to break out of that bubble. Like, do you consciously follow different accounts on social media? Do you consciously, I consciously try to read like Associated Press or BBC or something that, is more dry but factual, but it's more dry, so it's not quite as fun. But what I found one of the best things to do, and I'm sure you're doing this already, is to have conversations with people who are not necessarily on the same page with me and just ask them questions and listen to their answers. That has just been so mind-expanding to me, because often what I've learned is we really do have more in common than what divides us. And even though we might disagree entirely on the end result, we were actually completely in sync for the first few steps of there's a problem, here's why it's a problem, here's why I'm worried about it, and we just start to diverge when we actually talk about the solution. And that's actually what's happening with climate change. Most people are actually on board with the idea that's happening, but a lot of people feel the solution is a bigger threat than the impacts. And so if we can focus on what we have in common more than what divides us, I feel like when we have conversations as humans, we often sort of start at the bottom of the pyramid where we have the greatest variety of perspectives. If we start our conversations at the top with something we agree on, and then the next level down, oh, we agree there too. Next level down, well, we're actually next to each other. And then we kind of go to where we disagree. There's a lot that we can learn from that, and I think a lot more productive conversations we can have. So, and again, you're probably learning that firsthand.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. And why don't we go to the very front here? Just wait for the microphone for 1 second. Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name's Abe Masliak. Thank you for being here. I'm with Citizen Climate Lobby, and thank you so much for your support. And carbon pricing is something we agree with. One thing that bothers me for the long term is that we talk about how climate change is going to affect our life in the future, and that it may not be livable. But I worry about the concept of migration, that there's going to be parts of the earth that are not going to be livable anymore, and the people that are there are going to have to go somewhere. And I'm wondering if migration could be a really big problem for humans in the future that we're not talking enough about. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that question. I would say it is already a really big problem today. And that's very important because, remember, the data shows that the majority of people say climate change is real and I'm worried about it around the world. But then if you ask people, do you think it is affecting you personally, the numbers get cut in half. But if you ask them, will it affect people in the future, everybody still says yes. So we have a big problem in that we're always talking about future issues and we're not talking about what's happening now. And this is what induces psychological distance, that head-to-heart gap. So people mostly agree that climate change will affect future generations, it will affect people who live over there, it will affect plants and animals, but they don't think it'll affect them. So that's why when we have these conversations, really making it about here and now, about things like the man with the oil rig on his hat and the little daughter, about things that are affecting things we already care about today. So to practice what I preach, a couple of years ago, I started a newsletter. And it's a free newsletter. It's called Talking Climate. You can find it on my website. You can find it on talkingclimate.ca. You can find it on LinkedIn. And every week, I share good news about a climate solution that's already happening now. And I was actually worried when I started. I thought I was going to run out. Like, I was doing this every week, and I'm like, OK, I got 3 months, and then I'm done. I'm cheating. I'm putting multiple good news pieces in every week because there's that much happening today. Then I have not so good news. And in the email version, I actually color code it, green and red. And people have asked me, can you just have like a drop-down menu so I don't have to see the not so good news? And I'm like, well, I can't do that in MailChimp, but I did color it red. But the not so good news is not about ice sheets or polar bears. It is about kids' health or fertility or bananas or sports or insurance rates or senior citizens or something that matters to us. And then in blue, I have what you can do. And every week there's a different suggestion of what you can do, but it's always about amplifying it by talking about it. So that's, I know you were asking about migration, but I think the greater point is migration's already happening. Economic impacts are already happening. Like, you know, the latest estimate was that the economic impacts from heat alone are already at almost $30 trillion already, and that is only heat, which if I had to guess is probably not the greatest share of the pie. Because if you look at hurricanes, the damage from those are... So we have to talk about what's happening here, what's happening now in ways that directly connect to people, but we also have to talk about what people can do. And I love this Bill McKibben quote. If you go to my Instagram account, I have this pinned to the top. He said, the most important thing an individual can do right now is not be such an individual. That's great. We are such an individualistic society. It's all about what I eat, what I wear, what I don't buy, how I don't do this or do this. But if you look at the big social issues of the past, we have had massive change. Think about the abolition of slavery. Think about women getting the vote. Think about the civil rights being enacted or the end of apartheid or gay marriage. We have had social change happen before, and every single time it happened, it was because people used their voices. So ultimately, I feel like the biggest lessons we have to learn are the lessons of history. And like you said, the very first question, Chris, about, you know, things are bad and good and bad and good. What history shows us is these oscillations have happened before. And the bigger they get, the closer we are to a social tipping point.
What a great place to end.